The death of Pope Francis in 2025 sent waves of grief across the globe, but behind the grand ceremonies and official tributes lay quieter, more personal stories, the ones that revealed the true heart of the man the world had come to know as the Pope of the people. Among those stories, one moment stood out with breathtaking poignancy. The day Sister Geneviève Janengros, a humble nun who had been a close friend and confidant of Francis for decades, broke Vatican protocol in a way that moved even the most hardened officials to tears. Their friendship had been forged long before Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis, back when he was a Jesuit priest navigating the spiritual and political storms of Argentina. Over the years, Sister Geneviève remained a steadfast presence in his life, not a political advisor, not a figure of influence, but a sister of the heart, someone who knew the man beneath the papal vestments. Their bond was built not on power, but on prayer, not on titles, but on a shared commitment to serve the forgotten and the voiceless. As Pope Francis rose through the ranks of the Church, Sister Geneviève remained in the background, a hidden flame of encouragement and spiritual solidarity. When Francis faced criticism, she was the quiet voice reminding him that mercy mattered more than applause. When he felt the crushing weight of leadership, it was often her letters, simple, handwritten notes, that reminded him why he had said yes to God's call in the first place. Their connection was rarely spoken of publicly, yet it endured like an unbreakable thread through every stage of his journey. So, when the news broke that Sister Geneviève had defied Vatican protocol to approach Pope Francis's coffin in St. Peter's Basilica, crossing barriers reserved strictly for cardinals, bishops, and dignitaries, those who truly knew Francis were not surprised. It was not an act of rebellion. It was the final act of a sacred friendship, one that even the highest human rules could not contain. On the day of Pope Francis's final farewell inside St. Peter's Basilica, the atmosphere was charged with an almost unbearable weight of sorrow and reverence. Pilgrims from across the world gathered under Michelangelo's great dome, their heads bowed, their faces wet with silent tears. Cardinals in crimson robes lined up in orderly procession to pay their respects. Swiss guards stood in polished armor, their spears gleaming under the solemn lights. Vatican officials enforced strict protocols, ensuring that only authorized clergy and dignitaries could approach the Pope's coffin, placed at the foot of the great altar, a symbol of sacred order and tradition. Yet, amid all the rigid choreography, there was a deeper movement stirring, the movement of human hearts breaking quietly for the man who had refused to let his papacy become about grandeur and rules. And then, from among the crowds of mourners standing respectfully behind the barricades, a figure emerged, a small, elderly nun in a simple habit, her hands trembling not with fear, but with love. It was Sister Geneviève. Though not a cardinal, not a bishop, and certainly not a political figure, she stepped forward with a determination that stopped the room. For a brief moment, confusion flickered among the guards. This was against protocol. The boundaries were clear, and yet no one moved to stop her. Something about the purity of her grief, the rawness of her sorrow, froze everyone in place. Those who knew her whispered her name under their breath, understanding immediately that this was no act of disrespect. It was an act of love, deeper than any protocol could comprehend. Sister Geneviève moved slowly, reverently, her eyes locked on the simple wooden coffin where the man she had called brother, friend, and spiritual companion now lay in stillness. And as she crossed the invisible line that separated hierarchy from humanity, the entire basilica seemed to fall into a deeper, holier silence, the kind of silence that only happens when heaven itself leans in to listen. Sister Geneviève, with slow and deliberate steps, made her way across the ancient marble floor until she stood directly before Pope Francis's simple, unadorned coffin. Her hands, aged and worn by decades of silent service and hidden sacrifice, reached out not to touch the coffin, but to clasp together tightly in prayer. Then, without any hesitation, she dropped to her knees. There was no grand display, no dramatic gesture, only the purest, most unfiltered expression of grief and devotion. The moment was so raw, so achingly real, that even the rigid solemnity of the official ceremony seemed to bend around her. Cardinals, who moments earlier had processed with ceremonial dignity, now lowered their heads in humility. Tourists who had stumbled into the basilica out of curiosity now wept openly. Guards who were trained to intervene looked away, their eyes filled with unspoken tears. In that instant, Sister Geneviève was no longer just a small nun. She was every friend who ever lost a loved one, every soul who ever wished for one last moment to say goodbye. Her prayers were whispered, but those closest could hear fragments. Words of gratitude, words of love, words of farewell. She thanked God for the life of her friend, for his courage to walk paths no one else dared, for his refusal to let the poor and forgotten be forgotten still. She whispered memories of shared moments, of laughter over simple meals, of encouragement exchanged in dark times. And finally, she promised him that she would continue to pray for him, for the Church, for the world he had loved so fiercely. It was a scene so intimate that it almost felt like an intrusion to witness it. Yet somehow, it became a gift to all present, a reminder that behind every towering figure of history, behind every world-changing leader, is a heart that longs simply to be loved and remembered. Sister Geneviève's kneeling figure became, in that moment, an icon of the human side of holiness, vulnerable, tender, breathtakingly real. As Sister Geneviève knelt before the coffin, pouring out the silent prayers and tears of a lifetime, the entire Vatican apparatus, so meticulously built around tradition, formality, and protocol, stood still, frozen not by confusion, but by awe. Vatican security guards, trained to act decisively and without hesitation, found themselves unable to move. The cardinals, those princes of the Church, who by centuries of tradition processed in majestic solemnity, did not signal to remove her or to restore the prearranged order. Even the papal masters of ceremonies, known for orchestrating every step of papal funerals with absolute precision, stood in stunned reverence. It was as if, for one sacred moment, all the rigid rules of church governance yielded to a higher law, the law of love. No one dared interrupt what was happening because everyone, from the highest official to the simplest pilgrim, recognized that they were witnessing something that transcended human regulations. In that silent consent, there was a profound acknowledgement of the truth that Pope Francis himself had lived and preached throughout his papacy. Mercy before judgment, love before law, relationship before ritual. Sister Geneviève's defiance of protocol was not rebellious. It was faithful. Faithful to a deeper obedience, the obedience of the heart that recognizes when the Spirit moves and knows enough to step aside. In that moment, the Vatican officials understood, without a word spoken, that they were being taught one final lesson by the man inside that coffin, through the humble actions of a grieving friend. In a place defined by centuries of carefully preserved tradition, something radical happened. Tradition bowed to tenderness, rules yielded to reverence, and a funeral mass for a pope became, for a few breathtaking minutes, a celebration not of hierarchy, but of human, holy love. Long before the world knew Jorge Mario Bergoglio as Pope Francis, before the white cassock and the flashing cameras, There existed a friendship built not on politics or ambition, but on the simple, often invisible paths of humility and hidden service. Sister Geneviève first met Father Bergoglio in the back corridors of the slums of Buenos Aires, where she worked tirelessly among the poor and abandoned. He was a young priest then, struggling to carry the burdens of leadership without losing his soul to pride or despair. She was a seasoned missionary, hardened by years of facing suffering, but softened by the immense tenderness of Christ's mercy. Their friendship blossomed quietly, away from titles and public acclaim, rooted in mutual respect for each other's commitment to the forgotten. It was Sister Geneviève who encouraged Father Bergoglio during moments of deep discouragement, reminding him that the kingdom of God advances not through grand gestures, but through small, faithful acts of love. When Bergoglio rose to become Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and later, astonishingly, the Pope, their friendship did not change at its core. She remained his spiritual sister, a confidant who prayed for him daily, who never treated him like a celebrity, but always like a brother in Christ. She never sought favor or recognition. In fact, most Vatican insiders had no idea of their enduring bond. Their correspondence remained private, filled with simple updates, shared prayers, and the kinds of words that strengthen weary hearts in a battle that few outsiders ever fully comprehend. It was not the type of relationship that made headlines. It was the kind of friendship that made saints. And it was precisely this hidden, faithful companionship that explains why, when the time came to say goodbye, Sister Geneviève could not remain behind the barriers. She had not merely known the Pope, she had known the man. She had walked alongside him in the unseen valleys of his life. And when the world mourned a pontiff, she mourned a friend. Her final act of crossing the line was not a violation of protocol. It was the inevitable culmination of decades of unseen, uncelebrated love. As Sister Geneviève knelt in prayer, her fragile figure bowed before the simple wooden coffin. A profound wave of emotion began to ripple through St. Peter's Basilica. What had begun as a formal, tightly orchestrated ritual now gave way to something deeper, something almost too raw for words. People standing along the marble aisles wept without shame. Clergy who had spent decades wrapped in the sober dignity of their offices quietly wiped tears from their faces. Even the Swiss guards, who prided themselves on absolute discipline, stood blinking back emotion, their rigid stances betraying the internal shattering of hearts. It was not merely the sorrow of losing a pope that gripped the basilica. It was the aching recognition that holiness is not about thrones or crowns, but about love, the kind of love Sister Geneviève was embodying right there before their eyes. No homily, no hymn, no carefully worded eulogy could have preached a better sermon than her simple act of kneeling. For a few breathtaking minutes, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of sacred grief, as if the very stones of the ancient church bowed their heads in mourning. In a world often skeptical of genuine emotion, where authenticity is masked behind ceremony, Sister Geneviève's unfiltered love broke through the coldness. Her grief tore a hole in the veil of formality, and through it, heaven itself seemed to draw near. Some later said it was the holiest moment of the entire funeral, a moment when the invisible realities of faith, hope, and love became briefly, painfully visible. When she finally rose, slowly, her body shaking not from age but from the unbearable tenderness of her farewell, the basilica remained silent, not out of protocol, but out of awe. No one dared move, no one dared speak, for they all knew they had witnessed something sacred, the triumph of love over every human rule, and the victory of friendship that not even death could erase. In the days following the funeral, as the world continued to mourn and speculate, Sister Geneviève remained silent, shunning the flood of media attention that inevitably tried to capture her story. It was not until a quiet interview with a small Catholic journal weeks later that she revealed what she had whispered to Pope Francis as she knelt at his coffin. Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight that no headlines could ever adequately express. She said that she leaned in close, barely daring to breathe, and whispered, "Thank you for loving until it hurt. Thank you for reminding the Church to be small enough to be great. Thank you for choosing mercy when it was harder than judgment. And thank you, dear brother, for never letting the world convince you that the cross was a defeat." These words were not rehearsed. They flowed from the wellspring of a relationship forged in decades of shared suffering, prayer, and hope. Sister Geneviève understood something few others did, that Pope Francis had carried not just the institutional burdens of the Church, but the personal anguish of knowing he could never fully fix its brokenness. She knew the cost of the radical mercy he preached. She had seen firsthand the loneliness that followed him, even into the highest office on earth. Her whispered gratitude was not just for the great public acts of his pontificate, but for the hidden sacrifices, the nights of sleepless prayer, the heartbreaks endured in silence, the quiet victories of faith wrestled from doubt. In those final words, Sister Geneviève gave voice to what millions could only feel but could not articulate: that Pope Francis's greatness was not found in the external power of the papacy, but in the interior immensity of a heart that had remained small, humble, and astonishingly open to God, even under the crushing weight of the world. The days following Sister Geneviève's unforgettable farewell became a time of unexpected spiritual awakening within the Church. Across Rome, bishops, priests, religious sisters, and lay people alike found themselves reflecting not just on the life of Pope Francis, but on what true Christian witness ought to look like. Her simple act of love, defying centuries of rigid protocol with nothing but prayer and grief, had pierced the institutional armor surrounding the Vatican and exposed a raw, beating heart beneath the grandeur. Homilies throughout Italy and beyond spoke less about church power and more about friendship, humility, and fidelity to Christ. In cathedrals and village chapels alike, people were reminded that sainthood is not achieved by titles or positions, but by daily, unglamorous faithfulness to the gospel. Seminarians studying for the priesthood revisited the life of Francis not as a political figure, but as a shepherd who lived close to the smell of his sheep, just as he had so often urged them to do. Perhaps even more remarkably, Sister Genevieve's act reignited discussions about the true mission of the Church in the modern world. Bishops' conferences quietly began to ask themselves whether the structures they so zealously protected had sometimes come at the cost of the tenderness Christ modeled. Young Catholics, many of whom had grown weary of seeing the Church as an institution obsessed with rules and appearances, were suddenly inspired by the vision of a faith that could break through barriers with love alone. Her action, though small and wordless, became a parable writ large, that at the end of all things, what remains is not how perfectly we maintained the externals, but how fully we loved. Sister Genevieve's crossing of the line at St. Peter's Basilica became a metaphor for what the Church itself is called to do: to cross the lines that divide, to risk disorder for the sake of compassion, and to remember that the law of love is always greater than the love of law. In the quiet shadow of one nun's kneeling figure, the Church glimpsed its truest, most radiant self. After the funeral of Pope Francis and the tidal wave of attention that followed, Sister Geneviève quietly returned to the hiddenness that had always marked her life. She declined interviews, refused offers to publish memoirs, and shied away from every opportunity to become a public figure. For her, the spotlight had always been a distraction, and she saw no reason to step into it now. Instead, she resumed her work among the poor, the forgotten, and the invisible, exactly as Pope Francis had lived and taught. In a small, crumbling convent tucked away from the grandeur of St. Peter's, she spent her remaining days in prayer, service, and simple acts of love that never made headlines. She understood in the depths of her soul that true greatness is measured not by how loudly one's name is proclaimed, but by how deeply one's life is hidden in Christ. For the pilgrims who came seeking her, those who had been touched by her quiet defiance at the funeral, Sister Geneviève offered only one thing: prayer. She would meet them briefly, hold their hands in her frail, trembling fingers, and promise to pray for them. She gave no speeches, no grand theological reflections, no sweeping calls to action. She gave them what Pope Francis had given her throughout his life: presence, tenderness, the sacred acknowledgement that every soul mattered infinitely to God. In the end, her life became a living continuation of the final lesson she had taught at the Pope's coffin: that love, real love, is quiet, persistent, and infinitely powerful. Her name gradually faded from the headlines, but her witness did not fade from the hearts of those who had seen her kneel on that day when all the world's ceremonies paused, and the Church was reminded of who she was meant to be. Sister Geneviève had crossed an invisible line, not just at St. Peter's Basilica, but across the entire Catholic imagination, drawing everyone closer to the heart of Christ without ever demanding that anyone look at her instead. In the end, Sister Genevieve's quiet act at Pope Francis's funeral was more than a moment of personal grief. It became a living parable for the entire Church. In kneeling before his coffin, she had reminded a watching world that the Church's true strength does not come from ceremony or power, but from love so fierce and so tender that it dares to break through every human boundary. She showed that the gospel is not a set of rituals to be observed, but a person to be embraced, even when protocol must be laid aside. Her silent crossing of the line became a mirror for every Christian to look into and ask, are we clinging to order at the expense of compassion? Are we willing to risk embarrassment, to risk misunderstanding, simply to love well? In her frail, prayerful figure kneeling on the cold marble floor, the Church caught a glimpse of her truest self. Not a fortress, but a family. Not a museum of rules, but a living body stitched together by the fragile, powerful bonds of mercy. Sister Genevieve's final gift to Pope Francis was not merely her presence at his funeral, it was the confirmation of everything he had spent his life preaching. By her simple act of love, she validated his mission one last time, proving that the revolution of tenderness he had called for was not a fantasy, but a reality that could be lived even within the heart of the oldest institution on earth. And through her witness, she called the Church not to reform merely its structures, but to reform its heart, to choose people over protocol, mercy over rigidity, and love over fear. Though her name may fade into the footnotes of history, her kneeling silhouette at the side of her friend will remain burned into the soul of the Church. A wordless sermon more powerful than any encyclical, a final homily more eloquent than any speech. For in the end, as Sister Geneviève and Pope Francis both knew so well, the only law that matters is the law written not in stone, but in hearts that refuse to stop loving, even when the world says they should.